he has that kind of that charisma, linguistic flair, which makes people pay attention. And he is, liked in parts of the country. And especially given that the Conservatives are worried about losing voters to reform, I think Boris Johnson is the kind of character who might sway that type of voter. Probably someone who voted for Brexit, someone who wants a more right-wing conservatism. They probably associate that with Boris Johnson.
With just one day to go, how many of us haven't actually quite decided where we'll vote? We'll look at how much is up for grabs on this final day. So it's going to be very busy. But let's get into it. The very final push for power. All of the leaders today of the main parties, will be hearing them pressing their core message. And for the Conservatives, they are hoping that the former Prime Minister will provide a much needed boost. We could say that Rishi Sunak sort of finally played his trump card just before 10 o'clock last night at the final Conservative rally, Boris Johnson. It was a 5-minute address, so he didn't speak for very long, but it was pretty punchy. Boris Johnson warned against the Putinistas letting in the Corbynistas and told voters not to give Labour a sledgehammer majority. That was when he was able to get a word in.
Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Good evening. Thank you very much. Thank you. I love it. Thank you so much, everyone. Can I first of all say how wonderful it is to see you all again? I feel deprived of your company, and how grateful I am to all of you for everything that you've been doing over the last few weeks, and for coming so late tonight to this venue, way past Keir Starmer's bedtime. If you're slightly surprised to see me, I want to be absolutely clear that I was glad when Rishi asked me to help. Of course, I couldn't say no.
And there he was, soaking up the atmosphere. Let me know if you think he helps or hinders. Well, speaking to Matt Chorley yesterday afternoon, ahead of the general election, Sir Keir Starmer's optimism showed through, perhaps really for the first time, as he spoke about the change in the Labour Party and the change he hopes to bring to the country.
That was the worst defeat since 1935, and people thought it would take at least 10 years or more to turn the Labour Party around. We got up, we did it, and what we're asking in a way is the opportunity, the chance, if people put their trust and confidence in us, to do the same for the country, pick it up from the state it's been left in by this government, and move us materially forward so people feel genuinely better off.
Well, there's 26 hours to go until the polls open. Joe Mays is UK politics reporter from Bloomberg and is here. Joe, good morning.
Good morning.
An 11th hour appearance from the former Prime Minister, 10 p.m. last night. What was Boris Johnson's pitch?
Well, kind of two main points, really, attacking Keir Starmer and saying he's not really fit to be Prime Minister. And if he does become Prime Minister, he will put up your taxes, increase immigration, all the kind of classic Conservative taglines from this campaign, but also really attacking reform and Nigel Farage. And as you said in the introduction, drawing attention to his support of Vladimir Putin in the past, and as don't let the Putinistas deliver the Corbynistas, and re-emphasising that warning about a Labour supermajority and making the case that if people do vote for reform, that's likely to help Labour win seats that the Tories would otherwise win. So yeah, it was kind of those two big messages from Boris Johnson. Yeah, it was a sort of an attempt yesterday, wasn't it, to show some Tory unity. We've got Boris Johnson, David Cameron, Michael Gove. You wonder, Joe, had they done this earlier in the campaign, maybe they wouldn't be fighting from a position so far behind in the polls. Yeah, I think you're right. I think that Rishi Sunak would have quite liked to have had Boris Johnson, I think, earlier in the campaign. I think, he has that kind of that charisma, linguistic flair, which makes people pay attention. And he is, liked in parts of the country. And especially given that the Conservatives are worried about losing voters to reform, I think Boris Johnson is the kind of character who might sway that type of voter. Probably someone who voted for Brexit, someone who wants a more right-wing conservatism. They probably associate that with Boris Johnson. So I think for Rishi Sunak, this is coming a bit late in the campaign. I think he'd have preferred it earlier. Yeah, talking about sort of the Conservative who maybe is much further on the right. I mean, Suella Braverman is talking to specifically that voter today, saying the Conservative Party sort of lost its way, and post the election it needs to veer further back towards the right to sort of regain its identity. Yeah, I mean, she's basically starting the conversation, or that will happen soon after a Conservative defeat. If that's what happens this week, and I think that there's going to be this real big intellectual discussion about what was the cause of the defeat. Is it because we weren't conservative enough, we weren't right wing enough, or is it because we were effectively a bit too right wing in government and we weren't competent enough, and we were punished by the voters for that? Clearly, it's where Bradman is making the case that there needs to be more right wing, cutting immigration more, cutting tax more. But there'll be others who say no, that actually that was the wrong approach. So it's a battle that's already begun.
Yeah, well, definitely. I mean, you talk about that. It's the Conservatives seem to think it's about 130,000 voters in 100 seats who could make a significant difference to the result of the election. Presumably, that's who Rishi Sunak is hoping Boris Johnson will have appealed to last night.
I think that's exactly right. I think that's the Conservative strategy now. That's where they think this election is. It's about, can they get those Reform voters to stick with the Conservative Party? And if they do, they think they could make kind of a meaningful dent into the size of what we expect will be the Labour majority. I think that they're arguing that if they get a really efficient allocation of those voters, that 150,000, 130,000, just take all of those voters in all the marginal seats, if they all just allocate their vote to the Conservatives rather than Labour, that could help the Conservatives win seats that would otherwise go to Labour because of the split vote between the Conservatives and Reform. I mean, it's asking for a lot. It's asking for a very efficient allocation of those votes. But if it were to happen to some degree, yes, I think would reduce the size of a expected Labour majority.
Well, let's talk about the Labour Party because, Starmer yesterday was repeatedly asked. I think he'll be frustrated about this, and he's taken it in good humour, and he did when he was speaking to Matt Chorley yesterday. Repeatedly asked, are you going to be a part-time Prime Minister?
Yes, he was. I mean, this comes back to those comments he made about how he likes to kind of protect some family time after 6 p.m. on a Friday because his wife is Jewish. But yeah, I think he thinks this is a sign of the Conservative Party being increasingly desperate in their attacks at the end of this campaign. I think that he makes the point that Rishi Sunak himself likes to protect time with his family. It's not uncontroversial things to do, and that you'd expect we should allow political leaders to have some protected time with their families. So I think he's trying to brush off that attack quite strongly.
Yeah, I mean they're managing expectations, aren't they? The Labour Party, they have been so cautious throughout this, and a lot of the questions are being framed in sort of potentially on Friday you're going to be in charge of, whether that might be prisons, the NHS. Today, do you think we might see a bit more sort of bullishness from them, or they'll sort of remain as they have done, cautiously optimistic, but saying please do not take the support you think we have for granted?
Yeah, I think we'll see a continuation of that cautious message. I mean, the speech that Keir Starmer gave over the weekend, making the point that no votes have been cast at this point. So, this result is not determined. And the Labour Party does still need people to turn out on Thursday and actually put a cross in the box next to the Labour candidate. That needs to happen en masse across the country, such that they get a majority. I think that reality is something that Keir Starmer wants to emphasise because he's still trying to push for that big Labour win. So, yeah, we won't see any signs of complacency or Labour getting ahead of themselves, I don't think. There's still an election to be won here.
I mean, some people have cast their vote, the postal vote. Some are desperate to do so, and they haven't arrived. I mean, can you explain to us, Joe, sort of the scale of the problem, how significant it is?
Yeah, I mean, there's kind of smatterings of seats across the country where this issue has arisen. I mean, it's partly because councils haven't printed enough ballot papers. It's partly because Royal Mail not delivering them quickly enough. And it's often, in many cases, driven by the fact that so many people do want to vote by post at this election becomes so close to the summer holiday. So that's a factor that I think councils were caught by surprise by, the number of people wanting to vote by post. It has some really interesting implications. I noticed that it applies to Kemi Badenoch's seat, where if there's a very tight result, it could be the case that, say she were to win, the Labour candidate could contest that result on the basis of the fact that the postal ballot system, the votes didn't go out in time, and they could contest the result such that could be a by-election. And that could mean that Kemi Badenoch could be ineligible to stand as a candidate in the Tory leadership contest, because when a by-election occurs, you're no longer considered an MP, and the Tory rules require you to be an MP to stand in the leadership contest. So, really interesting kind of consequence that could come from this postal votes the problems we're having now.
Yeah, I think it's about 45 constituencies affected by postal delays. There'll be more on that on Times Radio Breakfast. Joe, for the final time before the election, thank you so much. Joe Mays, UK politics reporter at Bloomberg, steering us through what we can expect